Hello, so over the past few years, I've been reading quite a lot of books on the internet and on our attention and how those things interrelate. And so I thought I would do one big video on many of the books that I read in that category so that I can more fully compare their approaches and what they talk about. The first book is Digital Minimalism by Newport. I read this in September of 2019. And this was really the first book that I read in this category, and I do think it's a good introductory place. However, I will say, looking back, I think this book is kind of underwhelming. I think it suffers from the extended blog post syndrome that I think a lot of non-fiction books are, meaning that I think they're just blog posts that have been bloated up into a full book. I also think it's coming from a non-internet person's perspective, which has both its downfalls and its benefits, because on the one hand he can very clearly see the effect of the internet because he is outside of it, but on the other hand I think that he isn't quite aware of how entangled your life can get into it and how hard it is, or how inevitable using the internet is in many ways for particular people of a different generation than he is in. This book is also presented in a very optimize yourself as a human being type framework, right? Like, he's talking about doing this because it will benefit you and thus make you a more productive worker and a more productive human and all of that. And that they aren't inherently wrong or bad things. It just feels like a very making yourself an incredibly efficient cog type mentality that doesn't really jive with me. I think that approach and that framework may be more resonant to other people than myself, though. I don't want to be too negative. I do think that this book is a good introduction, and I think that the essential message is really good. I think he actually has a really good definition of minimalism, which is to, instead of keeping everything in your life that gives you a little bit of value, look at the things that give you the most amount of value and focus on those and accept that letting go of things, even if they give you a little bit of value, is probably better in the long run. I think that's a really helpful way of framing minimalism and then approaching digital minimalism. This is certainly the most actionable of the books in this list. There's actual steps to take, and he gives many examples of people who have gone through those steps and has more specific examples that you can pick and choose from to apply to your own life. I also think that some of his steps are, while he gives more specific examples, and that's good, I think some of the steps are super broad. It'll be choose what is important on the internet for you, and it's okay, that's a really broad ask, and I get it because everyone's relationship to the internet is different. You can't really make a step-by-step action plan that suits all people without being really broad. I just think, for me personally, I didn't find the steps that helpful. I did much better just sort of making up my own approach to minimizing the internet. So I think it'll suit some people better than others. The next book is How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. I read this in October 2019, so soon after I read the Cal Newport book. Personally, I love this one. I think it's fantastic, and I know it's been getting a lot of praise and a lot of hype, and I think it's warranted, to be honest. I like that it's not purely negative on the internet. It's actually really more a contemplation about capitalism and making ourselves into a commodity. We're all these little entrepreneurs of a small business that is ourselves, and what is it like to live in a world like that then introduces the internet? She says in the book, quote, "Make oneself into a shape that cannot so easily be appropriated by a capitalist value system," end quote. One of the standout sections in this book is when she's talking about maintenance work and how maintenance work is often put on women, both in terms of labor and labor industries, but then also there is the very much unpaid maintenance work that women do. There was this one woman I remember who took it upon herself to shake the hands of every janitor in the building in which she worked, and that really just stood out to me. Quote, "Our very idea of productivity is premised on the idea of producing something new, whereas we do not tend to see maintenance and care as productive in the same way," end quote. I also love how she talks about how escapism isn't really the answer. Quote, "Some can more easily afford to refuse than others. Refusal requires a degree of latitude, a margin, enjoyed at the level of the individual, being able to personally afford the consequences, and at the level of society, whose legal attitude towards non-compliance may vary." she spends quite a bit of the book talking about, the attention economy and the internet and capitalism and how they all interact. But she makes a very important point that to be able to just say, well, I'm not going to engage with it is a really privileged position. But she also sees the value in it. She says, quote, "We have to be able to do both, to contemplate and participate, to leave and always come back where we are needed." She says it's not enough to just try and remove yourself from the system. You have to stay engaged with the system, at least in part, to try and make it better. And that's one of the things that I really did love about this book, is that it does talk about the individual, but it's really based in community, not the individualism, which is what I found in the Newport book. Quote, "Individual attention forms the basis for collective attention, and thus for meaningful refusal of all kinds." And she's also talking about not just refusal, but also action, action on climate change, action on justice, action on, insert important thing here, and that's why I appreciated this book. She took the ideas of attention to that extra level of, okay, where is attention needed? How is it being hijacked? And then if we are going to reclaim our attention, where are we then going to put it? And she puts that focus in community. She also talks a lot about nature and the importance of reconnecting with nature. She talks about bird watching, and I had never really considered that before I started watching the birds in my local area, or as she calls it, bird listening, because you often don't see birds. And I live pretty close to a park, and many birds will fly past my window, and it's been lovely, and I've been learning their names. And as she says, this can really build a sense of place that is contextual and personal, and it's almost kind of the exact opposite of what we get on the internet. I read this at the end of 2019, and so I've been doing this sort of very casual bird watching since then, and it's been just lovely. And this is the book that introduced me to that. I think that this book expertly interweaves art and science and philosophy and activism, but never from a place of superiority. She's never talking down to us. She's talking with us in a discussions that are obviously still quite fluid inside her own mind. And I think that was a very conscious tone that she took in the book. But I love interdisciplinary books, things that are pulling things together from different sections of life, or things that are often separated in life. And I think that is what makes this book stand out to me. The next is The Shallows by Nicolas Carr. I read this in July of 2020. For some context, in July of 2020, I was kind of doing this challenge where I wasn't on the internet really at all. I really pared it back. I wasn't doing any entertainment or media at all, and I think I did that for about 2, maybe 3 weeks, and I read this book during that time, and so that was definitely an interesting context to go into this book with. So The Shallows is a very researched look at how technologies have changed the way we think throughout history. It goes way back to the humble clock, then to maps, to the printing press, and eventually the internet. He argues that due to the plasticity of our mind, we begin to think in a way that's comparable to the technology we use. Our technology really becomes an extension of our nervous system, and our tech literally changes the structure of our brain. I liked this because it really put the internet into historical context without being stridently anti-internet. I mean, he is pretty anti-internet, but he also goes into how the book and the clock and the map, they really changed how our minds work as well. It's not just piling on the internet and saying this is where all the bad is. He looks at the pros and the cons of each technology and what it has given and taken away from our minds. I found his writing on the invention and the development of writing especially fascinating. When punctuation was invented, he also had a chapter that made me realize how memory is thinking, it is ourselves, and if we neglect our memory by this over-reliance on the internet for storing all of our thoughts and all of our knowledge, and we just look up on Google whenever we want to know something, it's really neglecting the actual processes in our mind of how we think, because thinking is memory. Quote, "The human brain continues to process information long after it is received, and the quality of memories depends on how the information is processed. Biological memory is alive, computer memory is not. later on he says, "We don't constrain our mental powers when we store new long-term memories, we strengthen them. The connecting is the thinking. The connecting is the self." I just found this a much deeper book than Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, which I found ironically rather shallow, but it was definitely coming from a different tack than How to Do Nothing. The Shallows is much more about neuroplasticity and historical context, whereas How to Do Nothing is more humanistic and artistic in its exploration. I will fully admit, though, that The Shallows is a bit outdated. It was published in 2010, so there's this one chapter where he talks about books, and he's talking about how ebooks are going to be enhanced with, hyperlinks and audio and video, and how this is bad for our brains. And I do think he actually makes a good argument about why that is bad for our brains, but it's just funny because, this definitely was being attempted by the book industry at the time, but has very much been abandoned since, thankfully, because, I don't think that would help ebooks at all. After he sets down this historical context, he does get to the internet, and he spends quite a bit of time talking about the internet. And I think he really nails down what the internet does to content. Quote, "When the net absorbs a medium, it recreates that medium in its own image. It not only dissolves the medium's physical form, it injects the medium's content with hyperlinks, breaks up the content into searchable chunks, and surrounds the content with the content of all the other media it has absorbed. All these changes in the form of the content also change the way we use, experience, and even understand the content," end quote. And I think that is just really true. However, I do think he gets a bit bogged down in talking about that. For me, the internet is not just about the content itself, it's about the mode of delivery. That is why I find the internet addictive. It's the intermittent variable update that is the cornerstone of so many websites. It's not just that we've chopped up media and mixed them all around, it's that they're then uploaded and updated in a kind of drip feed that varies at unpredictable, unreliable times. So that is, the intermittent variable, and that has been proven to be one of the most addictive ways to feed something to someone. It promotes not just us, jumping from one thing to the other, but always kind of wondering and wanting to check for what is the next update, what is the next hit, has something new happened. I read The Shallows when I was doing this challenge of really trying to basically not go on the internet at all. And one thing I noticed was that I wasn't actually craving the content that much. In fact, there was a certain relief in, not having to keep up with all of my YouTube subscriptions and podcasts and movies and whatnot. But my brain was still craving something, even though I wasn't actually missing watching things. I was craving the update. The only way I can describe it is that what I was thinking about was I wanted to know if someone had uploaded a video to YouTube. Had they uploaded a new video? Not necessarily actually watch that video. My brain was desperate to know what was new, not necessarily actually consume what was new. And this was a real revelation during this, experiment, that this update mechanism, for me anyway, was the major addictive force, not necessarily the content itself. But Nicolas Carr doesn't really focus on that, and that's not his fault. It's something that I found kind of lacking in the book. He places all the blame for, quote, "our desire for fast-moving kaleidoscopic diversions," end quote, on hyperlinks and, the disjointed nature of the internet. But for me, it's not just the content, it's also the mode of delivery that requires us to jump from place to place for that next unknown tempting update. But anyway, I learned so much from this book. It was well researched without turning into, academic speak. I found it fascinating and relatable, and it really was a standout for me. And I'm kind of desperate to reread it. So the fourth book is Because Internet: Understanding the New Rules of Language by Gretchen McCulloch. This is the first book that's a little bit of a swerve, because this one isn't really about how the internet is stealing our attention, although I do think it continues on from The Shallows in that it talks about writing systems and communication, but this takes a much more sociological perspective. How have people in the past and how do people now communicate through the internet? This was actually just really fun to read, honestly. It had these excellent categories of different people on the internet, based on when you first joined the internet, what sort of generation you're in, and the atmosphere in which you learned internet culture within. They were really interesting to learn, because it made me realize what an interesting time we're living in right now, because the internet's not going anywhere. It's going to be around for the foreseeable future. Everyone born from now onwards is going to grow up with the internet, whereas we're in an interesting time where many people are living who engaged with the internet at a different time in their life. This is the only time when people first went online in their 40s or 50s or 30s or whatnot, and then of course the internet itself was very different at those different times. So I found those categories really interesting. But this book is ultimately about linguistics, and she talks about how people have, developed this way of writing text through the internet with tone and even with gesture, and not necessarily just using like emojis, but using text itself and how it is presented. And it really feels like an extension of punctuation, representing what we can do through our voice through text alone, and I just found it fascinating. One thing that was really nice about reading this book in my endeavor to read about the internet is that this book wasn't necessarily pro or anti-internet. It was kind of neutral on the internet. It was actually just very pro-human. This is a book all about how humans find connections through whatever tools they have, and it brought just a little bit of sunshine into my reading on the internet. This is a book kind of full of hope and joy in talking about linguistics, and it was just really what I needed. Reading so many books about the perils of the internet, it was nice to just kind of break that up with something a bit different. And I think it would be a good addition to anyone's reading list if they're wanting to read about the internet. The next one is very different. This is called Hokoji, and it was written by Chomei. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. I read this first in October of 2020. And this is a very short, it's about maybe 12 pages long, kind of journal memoir type thing. It was written by a monk in 14th century Japan. And I heard about this recommendation through the Literary Disco podcast, which is a fantastic book podcast, highly recommend it. And this is so fascinating because the first half of it is really about the context in which he had lived his life up until this point. And then the second half is about him basically becoming kind of a hermit in the woods, living in a very small cabin. And it's his musings on that journey. The first half is so relatable. Remember, I read this in 2020, and he's talking about all these things that have just gone horribly wrong. There's political upheaval, there's fire. Remember, I live in Australia and we had, horrific fires at the beginning of 2020. He talks about tsunamis, and he, of course, talks about the plague that comes. And I read this, at the tail end of Melbourne's 2020 lockdown, so the plague section really stood out. But it just made me realise that kind of if you take anyone's life and you list a bunch of the disasters that have happened, everyone's going to have, a pretty long receipt. This is one of the earliest works that I've ever read, and to relate so heavily to it, and maybe that's just because it was an excellent translation, I don't know, but to relate so heavily to his experience, it really felt like time is just an illusion and we're all just experiencing the same thing at all times. One thing that stood out to me was this monk. He was very conscious of the fact that he was living at a time that was the beginning of one era and the end of another. And I definitely kind of feel that too. He says, quote, "Born into these vile latter days, it has been my lot to witness such heartbreaking things," end quote. And the little reference note that adjoins that sentence says, "It was common belief that the world had entered the latter days of Buddhist law, a degenerate age when evil was rife." And this just stood out to me because there's so many, it made me think of late stage capitalism and how many people on the internet joke about it, there's memes, but it reflects something real that we're living through. And I do think actually that the internet is a part of that transition. I think climate change is also another part of that transition, that it does feel like we are living at a time of transition. Once he leaves and he makes his little hut, there's this little drawing in the book of his hut, and it's so cute, and I just loved it. And I don't know whether it was his drawing because the annotations are in English, but maybe they were translated. I'm not sure who drew that little drawing in the story, but it's just so cute, and I loved it. You know, this short memoir, it's really a meditation on attention and on home. And he begins to really focus his attention on nature. And despite his, Buddhist practice, he does grow attached to his home. The whole point was to remove himself and to detach and let go of attachment to things. And then he begins to grow attached to the place he made for detachment. I think it's actually really well put. He says, quote, "Best by far is the company of flute and strings and of the flowers and moon," end quote. It was just nice to read, but it never gets too saccharine. He really is just articulating well what it means to be human. I will say it did make me think, this man, he doesn't like society very much, so he leaves and builds a hut in nature. And I think, honestly, that's kind of an idealized vision of life these days. But, escapism isn't possible, or even really the answer anymore. And this connects back to How to Do Nothing, where she talks about how extracting yourself from the scenario isn't really possible. This book and his musings on the beauty of nature, it made me realize that, unfortunately, nature is going to be an ever-growing privilege. I do live in Australia. We had horrible bushfires, and we are going to continue to have horrible bushfires. Climate change is real, and as it increases, safe and consistent access to nature will become ever more a privilege. And I don't think that the world has really reckoned with that yet. And I speak as someone who is privileged enough to have safe and consistent access to nature, and I think that kind of almost conflicts with How to Do Nothing, because she really says that nature is a solace and it's a place for us to engage with outside of the internet, and that's true, but I don't think she really engages with the fact that nature is already and is going to continue to become a privilege for the few. And how do you do that if you don't have access to nature? Many books these days talk about the beauty of nature and how we need to reconnect with it, but don't necessarily acknowledge the fact that it's not available to everyone, and it's going to be available to less people as time goes on. Having said that, that's not a criticism of this. This was just a really lovely read. It's, shockingly relatable. It's really beautifully articulated, and it's just a fascinating historical document as well, of a time and place that I'm never going to know intimately, but I can still relate to someone's experiences from that time, and I just think that's really nice. So the last book is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. This is the most recent read for me. I read this of April 2021, and this is really interesting because it was written and published in the 1980s, and it isn't about the internet, it's about television. He very briefly comments on computers, but they're not the beast that we live with today. He's really focused on television because that is the primary medium of that time. I will say I think this book suffered a little in being the last one I read, because when it would have great ideas, but they'd often be a repeat of what I'd already read in previous books, even though this one was published first. It just had some out-of-date references, or out of date for our time, obviously, that I just didn't get. But one thing I found interesting and a bit surprising was that he's actually not concerned with, TV junk. He says, quote, "I raise no objection to television's junk. The best things on television are its junk. We do not measure a culture by its output of undistinguished trivialities, but by what it claims as significant. Therein is our problem, for television is at its most trivial and therefore most dangerous when its aspirations are high, when it presents itself as a carrier of important cultural conversations," end quote. I really like that, because I think that's a good point, in that his critique that making everything into entertainment is only a problem with the non-entertainment things. I will say this is a very American-focused book. It's not a bad thing, but I do think he kind of has a rose-tinted view of past America. And it's tricky because I think he has valid criticisms of modern technology and television, but then I think he tries to back up those criticisms by excessively valorizing the past. You know, if you drew a picture of the past of America just from this book, you would think that everyone was intelligent and engaged and happy and free, when that is obviously just not true. You know, the past had so many problems despite how focused on the written word they were, you know, and he never really engages with that or even mentions that they had problems, you know. For example, quote, "Prior to the age of telegraphy, the information action ratio was sufficiently clear so that most people have a sense of being able to control some of the contingencies in their lives," end quote. Like, really? Like, he's talking about the invention of the telegraph, like Morse code and things. So he's talking about a period pre-1840s, and like, does he really think that most people really felt in control of their lives in pre-1840s America? Because, like, I can think of a few people who probably didn't feel that way, who probably didn't feel in control of their lives. And, like, he doesn't provide any proof of that statement. He just believes that most people felt a clear sense of control in their lives. And it's like, really? Like, I agree with his point that we have a high amount of unactionable news in our day-to-day life now, right? Like, we get news from all over the world all at once and we can't do anything about it. But he backs up that idea with a point that I don't think is true. I think he just had a very pinholed view of history, which is a shame because it undermines his good arguments. However, he does have a fantastic chapter on criticizing the news, and I think it is one of his strongest arguments about how it has kind of warped into this emotionally disconnected, intellectually disconnected mosaic of news articles that are never really linked with anything. They're completely decontextualized, and it leads not to people being uninformed, but to people not being able to perceive if they're uninformed or not. I also think his chapter on the negative effects of television commercials and how they intersect with politics is fantastically done. He points out that capitalism basically stops functioning with the introduction of TV ads. Quote, "Its principal theorists believed capitalism to be based on the idea that both buyer and seller are sufficiently mature, well-informed, and reasonable to engage in transactions of mutual self-interest. Rationality was the driver, but television commercials make hash of it." He then says, quote, "The television commercial is not at all about the character of the products to be consumed. It is about the character of the consumers of products. They tell nothing about the products being sold, but they tell everything about the fears, fancies, and dreams of those who might buy them. The television commercial has now become pseudo-therapy through fantasies." End quote. And if that's what television commercials does to products, he extends it to what it does to politicians. Quote, "We are not permitted to know who is best being president or governor or senator, but those whose image is based on touching and soothing the deep reaches of our discontent. Men always make their gods in their own image, but to this television politics has added, those who would be gods can refashion themselves into images the viewers would have them be." End quote. I do think that the weakest chapter for me is when he talks about the perils of education outside of the classroom. You know, he goes on about the dangers of Sesame Street. And I just think that, you know, making a song out of colors or the alphabet is not the degradation of society, mate. Like, that's not it. You know, he critiques this highly lauded university lecturer who is well liked because he adds entertainment into his lectures. And I'm like, but isn't that the very thing that he was valorizing in past speakers for doing? You know, he talks about past speakers and how they would hold people's attention for hours. And it's like, but then he's criticizing present day people for doing it in ways that he deems as based in entertainment. I found that a bit of a muddled argument. Having said that, perhaps this is where, like, the time difference, this was written in the 1980s, and I don't know what it was like there. This might be where me extending his criticisms of television onto the internet falls apart, because I think that there are plenty of non-entertainment based educational resources online, like a ton. They don't have 3 hallmarks of education for television that he laid out in his book. They can be very dry and boring, as seems to be what he wants, but perhaps he's right that those resources didn't exist in, 1980s American television. I don't really know. I do recommend reading it. I think he has a very captivating writing style and he makes some good arguments. I ultimately felt that some of his arguments were better supported than others. Alright, so that's it. I hope this video is helpful to someone. On a personal note, over these past couple of years, I've made many changes to how I engage with the internet through, a horrible process of trial and error. And ultimately, I have landed on a much better relationship with the internet. I'm in a much better place than I was just a few years ago. And over that time, these books have helped me think about these things and realize my own perspective on an approach to the internet. So yeah, for me, I think the standouts were probably How to Do Nothing and The Shallows, but I honestly got something out of every single one of these books, so I don't think there's one that I would actively not recommend. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.